In this chapter, we're kind of largely summarizing what happens in environmental economics. And so I'm not entirely sure why they push it all the way to chapter 10, but they do. Um, what we're going to see here in chapter 10, chapter 2, chapter 3, here in week 2 of the modules is, if we were taking an environmental economics course rather than an ecological economics course, what we would do is we would spend the majority of our time talking about concepts like, in this chapter, market failures and the presence of externalities. So, what our purposes for this week is over the course of 3 chapters to give you kind of a pretty quick introduction to environmental economics, which would be how a standard mainstream trained economist would view economic and environmental problems. It's useful because even though that's not the full design of this course, to look at those things, the reason why it's important is because what it does for us is it allows you to have conversations with others outside of EOU, but it allows you to have conversations with individuals who've had environmental economics so that you can then highlight for them maybe where their own analysis is a bit more lacking. Okay. So again, when we're looking at environmental economics, the whole purpose of it is to look for inefficiencies. Um, and the concept that's repeated time and time again in environmental economics, or even just in a standard economics course, is that what markets are really good at are finding um, efficiency, meaning optimality, meaning the resources that we have are being used to produce the maximum amount of output. If for most goods, most of the time, the idea is that if you let markets where we have demand and supply curves, if we let the markets figure things out, what we will find is that our efficiency is maximized. Now, the environment is one type of market, right? And so you can already see here, we might run into some problems because we might not think that the environment should be considered a market good. But the environment is one of those goods that we as economists think run into problems when things are allocated by um, the market. And the inefficiency that emerges, the problem that causes is it causes a problem for how things are allocated and how much the environment is quote unquote used as things are being produced. With the general idea that when it comes to the environment and the idea that people are just trying to profit privately as much as possible, that generally speaking, the environment is overused because the individuals don't face all the private costs of using up the environment. And so they overuse natural resources, they overuse the environment, and they cause costs on others that are not privately paid for. So, with that idea, the way that an economist then approaches that problem and that situation is that then they say, okay, right, this isn't a big deal. We have market failures. I wouldn't say all the time, but market failures aren't that unusual. And so all that we really need to do, this is kind of highlighted here on this slide, all that we really need to do is find a better pricing mechanism, right? And if we find the right pricing mechanism and we find a way to internalize all of these costs that we were saying are external, if we find a way to internalize those costs, make people pay for the economic destruction that they're causing, then we will get efficiency. Right? So here in the state of Hawaii, I moved here from the state of Wisconsin. And so as an example of this, I was with my I was driving, I think, a Honda Civic, I think, when I lived in Wisconsin. And basically, right, what do? I pay for gas, right? I buy gas for my car. So I would put gas in the car. And, when I would drive my car, yes, I have to pay the private cost, of gas when I drive my vehicle. But the problem is that my car also creates pollution. It dripped oil, it dripped other fluids, it creates exhaust out the tailpipe, right? And that could, and I drive the car, and that makes the roads more crowded, so it causes traffic jams and whatnot, right? So you're getting an idea of all these extra costs that are being imposed. Well, part of part of the gas um, price are various federal taxes. And those federal taxes that are paid on gasoline are supposed to pay for roads, are supposed to help pay for public transit to kind of reduce, all these kinds of negative externalities, all these external costs to driving your own personal car. When I moved here to the state of Hawaii, what I found interesting is that, yes, I'm still paying the same taxes on my gasoline, but I also now pay for my registration tax, the annual registration every year, I pay a fee based on how heavy my car is. The idea is that if you pay for your registration in part by the weight of your vehicle, you're going to account for, how big of a vehicle you have, how much of a strain you're putting on the roads. It's a kind of a quick and dirty way to kind of make some individuals who have bigger private cars pay more, and to encourage people to drive smaller slash fuel efficient cars. Right, and also too, you can move to a city where there's a strong public transit system, and sometimes your employer, the school, will allow you to, pay for the transit pass, pre-tax as a way to incentivize people to do the right thing, right? To compensate them for the positive externality they're generating. Or, right, we could find a way where, we maybe make people pay for parking to discourage them from driving their own private vehicle. The reason why it's so difficult to be an environmental economist is that what you end up doing is you end up spending a great deal of your time trying to figure out a way to incentivize people to do the right thing for the environment. And the problem is that, especially when it comes to the environment, is that the environment is, there's not a lot of private ownership when we talk about the environment, right? We're talking about the sky, we're talking about the sea, we're talking about the forests. And so, how do you develop prices when the goods aren't privately owned? Right? Because those prices, as we kind of have here in the first bullet point, are going to be the key way that we signal scarcity for things. And we see that all the time, right? We certainly see that, when something is in high demand, when it's scarce, it's going to be a much higher price. Um, and what those prices do, right, the way that the prices are structured is they help us find the equilibrium. They balance the demand and supply. If those prices don't exist as they should, then the problem is that when it comes, let's say, to the environment, we don't have equilibrium. And what's the problem with not having equilibrium? Well, the problem there is that, not enough people ride the bus. Too many people drive their own cars. We have all these inefficiencies and misallocations that occur. What is it that distinguishes, for instance, the environment from a private good? The two key characteristics that we're going to talk about here are here in bullet 4. That private goods are excludable and that they are rival. So this rather mundane topic was actually the focus of my dissertation, if anyone's interested. Um, most goods are excludable and rival. And we'll talk more about what these individual characteristics are, but the quick definition here would be that excludability means that there's a way to prevent the use by someone who doesn't help pay for it. Right? So if you don't pay for a ticket to go see a movie, then you don't get to go in the movie, right? You don't get to go in the theater and watch it. Rivalry means that my use reduces or diminishes your use, right? So if I buy a can of soda, right, then me drinking it means that you can't drink the same thing, right? Every drop that I drink, that's one less drop that you can drink. The problems emerge when we talk about public goods, and the purpose of my research for my dissertation was quasi-public goods. Public goods are both non-excludable and non-rival. A perfect example of a public good would be something like the police department or the military. My enjoyment of protection from the fire department doesn't reduce your same protection from from those forces. Additionally, it's really difficult if you're creating a safe population that's free of fire. You can't. It's really difficult to say, I'm not going to put out your house fire because you didn't pay for fire protection, right? It's really hard to exclude individuals because if I don't put out their fire, it could spread to my house, right? Same with national defense, right? If I protect someone from a foreign enemy, it's difficult for me to create protection if I'm excluding those who don't help pay for it. So with most public goods, what we realize is that it's really difficult to create a price for them. And so what we do typically with a public good is well, for most of the time, we have the government supply the good and it's paid for with taxes, right? Because then you have a way to ensure that everyone helps contribute to financing it. My research was on quasi-public goods, goods that were excludable but were non-rival. What kind of good would that be? Well, the big kind of good that would be information. So my research was on academic research, like the journals that academics read. Well, these are non-rival because once the information is out there, right, it doesn't reduce your same consumption of that information. But if you don't pay for access to the journal, then you don't get it. So the question becomes one of how do you finance that? Well, I'll make you read my dissertation. No, I won't do that. It turns out what you can do is you can create multiple pricing mechanisms. You can have mechanisms for both the reader as well as the author, and make each of them help contribute to the total costs for the product. Find a little bit better of an equilibrium in that market. So typically, I'm just going to put my focus in here. So typically, what we see, especially if you took principles of microeconomics, we talked about how markets fail um, in part when they don't have perfect competition, right? And so we can look at that as a structural problem. Sometimes a market is set up, for instance, when it has a monopoly or an oligopoly, these forms of imperfect competition where the price isn't as low as it possibly can be. And the way that monopolies and oligopolies are able to continue to exist is by stopping new competition from entering. So, for instance, if I wanted to start a new airline, it's a pretty expensive process, and it's going to be a politically oriented process. It's going to be pretty difficult to do, right? And even if I do successfully start this airline, the existing airlines are going to flood their market with flights to help put me out of business, right? And the net result of all that is that we as consumers all pay a little bit more for flying because there's not that much competition in the market. In fact, if we look at in the United States, four airlines basically capture um, what is it, some 80% of the market. Um, there's only six major airlines in the United States, I think. But if we look Delta, United, American, that's like 70% of the market. They are the big players, right? Alaskan, well, they just bought Hawaiian Airlines, but Alaskan, JetBlue, Southwest, I mean, they get some of the scraps, right? It's a tough business to be in. The prices are a little bit higher, and there's a bit of a presence uh, of market imperfections, of market failures. That's not the point of this course, though. The point of this course is what's on the right-hand side. The purpose, oftentimes, the role, oftentimes, for an environmental economist is to talk about the undefined or poorly defined property rights that typically lead to resources being overused. The idea is that what the environment suffers from is what we would call the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is that if you go out in the world and let's say I'm a fisher, right? I'm a fisherman, an angler, right? And I go out in the world and I go out on my boat and I start collecting fish, then I'm gonna fish as much as I can because if I were to try to like not catch the female fish or not disturb their egg laying or certain kinds of things, activities like that, I'd have no incentive to do that because the fisherman in his boat right behind me is going to catch that fish if I don't do it, right? So I should be super enthusiastic about catching as much fish as possible because if I don't, someone else will. And that's what happens with common pool resources, is that there's no incentive um, to conserve that resource. So it's overused. So the best thing that you could do is allow people to buy property rights, to allow the environment to basically be purchased, right? No better way to stop a forest from being over cultivated than to say to people, well, why don't you buy the forest, right? Because then what they will do is they won't cut too much of the wood and they will replant things when trees are cut down. They will only do that if there's some private ownership in the overall scheme. Okay, so and I'm just going to skip over this. This is just more for you kind of understanding. Um, well, actually, let's not skip this. So what we want to do here is we want to take our understanding of um, private goods and just general capital that can exist, and now translate that into what happens when we're looking at natural capital and when we're looking at public goods, or at least an environmental good that's a common resource. How can we use the market mechanisms that are prevalent in our entire society? How can we use the market to the advantage of the environment? What we're trying to do here, and if you take, especially if you take a course like intermediate microeconomics, there we focus on this concept, this term called Pareto optimality. And what we talk about in Pareto optimality is finding situations where the marginal benefits are equal to the marginal costs. And you might remember that equation being relatively important, especially when it came to talking about, in a principles course, about how do you know when you've done too much of something. You know you've done too much of something when the benefit to doing that activity is equal to the cost of doing that activity each additional time. The only, the goal then is to reach this point of Pareto optimality. You know you've reached Pareto optimality when one party can't be made better off without making someone else worse off. That would be the point when there'd be no tendency for change, when you've reached that point of equilibrium. Right, so part of the focus then becomes one of, especially in a private market, the dominant question is, how do you know when it's too much, when you've done something too much? And again, the way you would know that is because you've done too much when that thing that you're doing is costing more to do it one more time than the benefit that you gain from doing it one more time. So again, what a market good does for us, private goods, the kind that you dealt with when you took principles of microeconomics, principles of macroeconomics, your life is really easy, right? Especially if you're not talking about the environment, things are rather easy because all that we're talking about is rival goods, excludable goods, and just ensuring that we are finding the optimal price. Finding the optimal price leads to us having the optimal amount produced, the Pareto optimal amount produced. The complications come when goods are no longer rival and no longer excludable. Man, those animals look mad at each other. Guessing that must be from a zoo. And what are those things? What are they eating? What do those look like? Banana? No, they're not banana. Pears? Apples? Potatoes? I'm guessing those are zebras. I'm guessing. I'm not too happy with each other. Well, I didn't generate the image, but it does show rivalry. I'm guessing it's apples because this example is talking about here apples. Yeah, I mean, right? Every apple that whatever this animal is eating means that something else can't eat it. That rivalness exists for the market goods, the standard goods we talk about, makes it rather easy because that would mean that the pricing mechanism helps us sort out who gets what. Because if you get it, that means I don't get it, right? And so paying a certain price decides this rivalness issue. Okay, let me pause here. So then a pretty good way to kind of organize this would be that we can think, and you may have seen this kind of table before, depending on who you had for principles in microeconomics, but you could organize a pretty easy table, right, where goods have either rivalness and they're either rival and excludable, non-rival, non-excludable, rival, non-excludable, non-rival, excludable. And that's what you see right here. And this was, again, kind of the purpose of my dissertation from long ago, was talking about goods that were non-rival but excludable. This kind of category right here. Most of the goods that you talked about in your principles class were all in this sector right here. So what does an environmental economist focus on? They focus on these two categories right here. Public goods, to some extent, but also if you take public finance with me, you'd also have some focus here. But a lot of environmental economists are really in this sector right here. Non-excludable rival goods that tend to be overused. Open access resources. And so I just in the interest of time here, what you see then is that these next 4 slides just kind of give you a review of those 4 kinds of goods. But I've already largely talked about them. So you'll have the slides, you can read these here, but I've already kind of largely talked about these. So again, what the environmental economist then focuses on is this idea of talking about common use resources, goods that are non-rival, non-excludable, or at least excludable but rival. And with that, also talking about the existence of externalities. Now, environmental economists spend a lot of their time talking about externalities because what it does is that it reinforces this idea that markets are still the most important thing. What markets allow us to do is they allow us to find greater efficiency in things. And so then all that we have to do, right, if we identify these externalities existing, is we just need to price things better, right? So in fact, what it does is it reinforces, for environmental economists, it reinforces how important the market mechanisms are and pricing mechanisms are. Without those things, we have overproduction or underproduction of certain goods. If I made everyone pay for their vaccines, right? We know that some people with a choice of either do I eat or do I get a vaccine, they would possibly choose not to get a vaccine. But what we know about vaccines, what we think we know, at least what I believe, is that vaccines are a good thing in the sense that if enough people have a vaccination, then we stop the spread of certain diseases. And right, what we as a society should try to do is allocate enough of them. We should allocate enough of them to those who can't afford them so that there's enough production of those things. And that would be the case where there's a positive externality. And then obviously we have goods where there's a negative extra, like car pollution or car congestion, where cars are overused. And so by imposing greater taxes, then maybe people will decide to use public transit or not to use things at all. But again, you can kind of see here the purpose of an environmental economist is to identify these externalities being present, measure them, and then implement them into policy. Now, Ronald Coase becomes pretty important here, and you may have heard of him. But what you see in the Coase theorem is that you don't, just because you identify that a externality exists, it doesn't necessarily mean that the government has to get involved. So this is obviously a little bit of this comes out of the University of Chicago. And at the University of Chicago, they really like markets and they like limited government intervention. And what Coase didn't like was that every solution for the environment has to involve the government in some way. And so what he said was essentially, okay, as long as you give people clear property rights, as long as you allow people to negotiate with each other for those rights, you can actually still remove externalities. So let me give you an example of how that would look. What you would do is you would say, let's say I have asthma and it's affected by people driving their cars. Okay. So the government-based solution would be to say, okay, you can only drive your car, 4 days a week on, certain days of the week, and that's going to help us reduce the number of cars on the road and ensure that, there's not as much pollution out there. So you'd have to figure out how much pollution cars produce, how much less they will pollute if you have them driving less, and you'd want to ensure that that amount that the cars are driven less reduces my asthma problems. It's a lot to kind of figure out, right? Like how much less to drive. Coase just says, listen, you do one of two things. You either say to people, you have a right to clean air, or you say to people, you have a right to drive your car. That's all you have to do. And in some sense, it doesn't matter which of those two you decide. That sounds a little bit odd, but it's true, at least for an economist. Because then what you say is, let's say that people have a right to drive their car. Let's kind of take this kind of weird example to an extreme here. We say to people, you have a right to drive your car, but I suffer from asthma. So what would I do? I don't know. I'd probably create a coalition of asthma sufferers, right? And we'd get some money together and we'd basically pay off those who drive their car. We'd say, hey, we will buy your bus pass if you agree to ride the bus, or we will help you buy a smaller car to help avoid you being in a bigger car that creates more pollution. Right? And basically, we would pay off the car drivers enough so that they drive less. Alternatively, right, if people had a right to clean air and no one had a right to drive, then the car drivers of the world would pay people off, right? They would say to you, asthma sufferers, well, it's not like you can't, how much asthma are you willing to suffer from if I pay you something, right? And they would negotiate. They would bargain for the appropriate amount of pollution that would exist. Very difficult to do that kind of solution. And that's what's highlighted here in this last slide here, is that it's very difficult to bargain. I mean, listen to that, in the example that I gave you, right? It's pretty difficult to say to someone, let's get all the asthma sufferers together, right? Or how would I actually bargain with all the car drivers of the world? It's, again, too difficult to do. And so we don't see this done a great deal. Um, but again, those who tend to be a bit more Republican or conservative really like these market-driven solutions. Um, Probably the most interesting example I can give you with this is that um, Tesla makes a profit every year, but they don't make a profit from selling cars. They make a profit from the emissions permits that they're allocated every year by being a car manufacturer. Now, electric cars don't make any direct emissions, right? They run on electric, which does produce emissions, but at a distance, not like directly at the vehicle. So what that means is that Tesla can put out in the marketplace all of these permits because they don't make any cars that make any pollution. And who would buy them? GM, Ford, Stellantis, right? The makers of Chrysler Jeep, BMW, VW, right? They all make cars that produce pollution. And so they're going to buy those permits from Tesla. And those permits, that Closian solution, is what allows Tesla to make profits. I'm not sure exactly how much it is, but let's just put it in here and just see. That's quite a bit. Since 2017, over $10.4 billion. It's become the most lucrative aspect of their business. So they get a carbon credit revenue. 2024 alone, $2.76 billion, 54% increase. Quite a bit of money. Elon Musk should be pretty happy with Ronald Coase. And just in general, the free market solutions that we have. Okay.